Good evening and welcome to the Ferguson Library. My name is Alice Knapp and I'm president of the library, and as I make this very brief introduction, that's your cue to silence your phones so that when the real speaker comes up, we're all ready. And I just want to do a quick tell you about a couple programs that are coming up that are of interest. On Thursday night, 6:30 here, is the Geography of Bliss by Eric Weiner. It's another author program, so you are definitely invited to that. I often describe the Civility series, which is one of my favorite series, as we get to see really top-notch people in their field talk about civility. But the library also has a companion program called Community Catalyst Conversations, which we do with the Interfaith Council and UConn. And that's boots on the ground. What are we going to do to change our community to make it a better community? The next one is March 15th, 6:30 in this room, and we're talking about supporting mental health. And finally, I'd be very remiss if I didn't mention A Novel Affair, which is April 14th. This is our annual gala, and we actually close the library early for an evening, and come in. It's a great big block party in the library where you get to support the library, have fun, try out some restaurants, and get a chance to do the silent auction, maybe a live auction, and meet all your neighbors and friends. So please come out to support that. But with that, I'm going to introduce you to Joe Pisani from the Dylan Schneider Group. Along with Hearst Media, they are our partners in this program. Joe.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you to the library for all the great things you've done for this series since it began several years ago. Tonight we have an extraordinary guest. Gillian Tett's not only the editor of the U.S. edition of the Financial Times and a columnist, but if you saw in her biography, she has a Ph.D. in social anthropology. And what does that mean? It means in addition to understanding financial news, she asks questions that you don't typically expect of a journalist. Questions like, why smart people make dumb decisions. Questions like why putting everything in its place isn't such a bright idea. And how businesses can succeed by breaking down silos. Now, I presume you know what a silo is. For 30 years, I was in journalism. My publisher always used to say, we have to break down these silos between the newsroom and the advertising department. And I love silos, I confess, but I'm intrigued to listen tonight to learn how you have to break them down in your personal life. Gillian, as I said before, is the U.S. editor and columnist with the Financial Times. She trained as a social anthropologist, but became a journalist while she was doing field work in Central Asia, in the Soviet Union, in Russia. Before joining the FT, she was awarded a Ph.D. in social anthropology from Cambridge University. Her latest book, The Silo Effect, and many of you have copies of it, which was available in the back, was published by Simon & Schuster and looks at the global economy and the financial system through the lens of cultural anthropology. Gillian leads the FT's editorial operations in the region across all platforms. She writes a weekly column covering a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues throughout the globe. Her roles at the FT have included U.S. Managing Editor, Assistant Editor, Capital Markets Editor, Deputy Editor of the Lex column, Tokyo Bureau Chief, and a reporter in Russell and Brussels. She's been given an honorary doctorate from Lancaster University in the United Kingdom, one of the top 10 British universities. In 2014, she was named Columnist of the Year in the British Press Awards and was the first recipient of the Royal Anthropological Institute Marsh Award. Her other honors include a Society of American Business Editors and Writers Award for Best Feature Article, the President's Medal by the British Academy, and recognized as the Journalist of the Year and British Business Journalist of the Year by the British Press Awards. Join me in giving her a warm welcome, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Joe and Alison, for that incredibly warm welcome. And thanks to all of you for coming along tonight when you could be doing other funkier things like having a backyard barbecue tonight in this wonderful March weather, or something else. So I appreciate you all making the effort to come along here tonight and listen to me talking about my latest book. I'm essentially going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes just laying out what the key themes of the book are, and then I want to open it up to a discussion. One of the reasons I love talking in libraries is that these are very much temples of learning and the exchange of ideas. And one of the great things about being in a small, informal setting like this is that we can actually talk a bit, and I'd very much like to hear what you guys think, not just about the themes of my book, but we can talk about the media, about the FT, about the state of politics, or anything else that's on your mind. And I won't make too many guesses about the state of politics. But anyway, this book, as Joe says, was written really to look at a seemingly very simple question, which is, why is it that so often in the modern world we know people who are incredibly bright who go out and do really, really dumb things? Why is it that we're surrounded by institutions which are filled with very well-meaning individuals, maybe even including ourselves, that end up going completely off the rails in ways that subsequently seem quite spectacular? And I started asking that question really back in 2008, during the height of the financial crisis, because as you might have just heard from my slightly confusing biography, I used to run the financial markets team for the FT. And when the crisis hit in the autumn of 2008, I was running the market section out of London. And many of my friends, or at least the friends who weren't bankers, would say to me, why has this happened? What's going on? And there was a common perception that when I spoke to people who weren't bankers, that at the root of the crisis was the fact that the bankers had somehow either gone collectively mad, or were unbelievably stupid, or incredibly evil, or incredibly greedy, or probably all four at once. And I'd listen to my friends talking about bankers, and I'd say to myself, well, yes, maybe there are some greedy people in finance. Guess what? It's about money. Maybe some of them are a bit mad. Might be one or two evil people too. But for the most part, the people who I know who work in finance, and I'm not saying just because I'm standing here in a financial centre right now, but the people who I know who work in finance are not crazy, greedy, mad, evil. For the most part, they're actually pretty well-meaning people who are doing things that make sense within the context of where they're working. And the issue really was the context. Because when I looked around at the financial system in 2008, the thing that struck me very forcibly was that one of the great unspoken reasons for the financial crisis, one of the reasons why the bankers seemed to go collectively mad, was they worked in a system which was incredibly fragmented, incredibly marked by what I came to use the word shorthand, the word silos. And I think since you're an American audience, you probably mostly know what silos are. They originally started life as agricultural storage containers. The word silo actually comes from the word siros, which is Greek for corn pit. But in the 20th century, the word got borrowed by the military establishment to refer to missile devices or missile storage units, and then it became used for agricultural units, and then management consultants borrowed it to describe the problem of big institutions marked by incredibly fragmented internal structures. And what I meant by in practice when I thought about silos, thought about that issue of fragmentation, was that when I dived into the question of why some of the banks, some of the insurance companies had done some really stupid things, time and again I found this problem that the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing, the right hand didn't talk to the left hand, and worse still, the bankers and financiers who were scurrying around in their own little trading desks, their own little corners and departments, which weren't talking to each other, were so overwhelmed by what they were doing at their own little team, so incentivized by essentially a bonus culture which really encouraged them to just keep their eyes myopically on their own little team, that they weren't just beset by tribalism, they had tremendous tunnel vision too. I mean, the story I tell in my book is the story of UBS, which It used to be considered one of the safest banks in the world. In early 2007, you had regulators going around writing report cards on UBS saying that it was fantastically safe, solid, sound. And UBS thought it was fantastically safe, solid, sound. I mean, they spent most of the early part of 2007 essentially hiring consultants to come in and peer over and over again at their books, at the areas that they thought were the biggest potential risks, namely hedge funds and leveraged loans. And they went to enormous lengths to try and scrub themselves of risk with leveraged loans and hedge funds. And all the while, they missed the great elephant in the room, which was the mortgage-backed securities coming out of America. Why did they miss it? Well, I know that UBS is just over there, so some of you may know the story better than me. If you don't, UBS, being good, diligent, responsible Swiss citizens, wrote not one, but 3 separate, very detailed reports going through what went wrong. And that paints a picture of a bank absolutely beset by silos, by the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing. And the point that UBS makes, which is quite fair, is it wasn't just UBS. You look at what happened at Citigroup. You look at what happened at Merrill Lynch, at AIG. You look at almost any large financial institution. And the problem of silos is very, very glaring. But when I stopped and thought about it and looked around the world, what struck me next was that actually it wasn't just a problem of private sector financial institutions. The regulators, as any of you who have ever worked at a bank or worked in public sector will know, were fantastically fragmented too, fantastically marked or marred by tunnel vision and tribalism. So were the central bankers. Again, I tell in my book the story of the Bank of England, which is pretty much the same story of the Fed. But that was an institution which, like UBS, was full of bright people, for the most part very well-meaning, who wanted to understand how the world worked. But for the most part, the economists who were trained in macroeconomics just looked at macroeconomics. They didn't look at that grubby little thing called finance, which was rather low status by the end of the 20th century. That, economists didn't worry about money because money was just seen as a transmission device. And the people who looked at finance as the weeds of the financial market, for the most part, were sitting in a different department from the people who looked at macroeconomics. And they didn't talk. And I firmly believe that one of the key reasons why central banks were so incredibly blind to the impending crisis was this problem of fragmentation again. And that reflected a pattern which wasn't just found in the central banking institutions, it was much wider. I mean, you go to university departments these days, and until very recently, until the crisis, again, you had the macroeconomists sitting in one corner, you had people looking at finance typically sitting in another. You go to the media, my own profession, and once again, you see tremendous silos existing in most parts of the media. When I first joined the FT, I was actually part of the economics team. And the economics team on the FT was traditionally pretty high status. We had a lovely office which overlooked the river in the City of London, next to the editor's office, next to the mighty Martin Wolf. And we thought we were pretty good, and we spoke to the Bank of England. And then later, when I went to work for the financial markets team, I discovered that we sat on the basement overlooking the garbage cans, and we were about as far as it was physically possible to be inside one building from the economics team. And that wasn't planned, it was just something that just sort of sprung up because it seemed natural to assume that financial markets sat in one corner, macroeconomics at another, because that was how it was at central banks, that was how it was in the academic world, that was how it was in so much of the system. So silos, I believe, were endemic to the financial, a key cause to behind the financial crisis. But in 2010, I moved to America. I was given my current job, which is US managing editor, overseeing the American operations of the Financial Times. And one of the first stories that I had to oversee was a BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And I was sitting late at night reading through all the journalist copy. And suddenly, as I read all the stories about pollution, about oil spills, about stupidity, something hit me between the eyes. And I suddenly realized that if you took out the words BP and put the words UBS into the story, you were seeing, once again, the same pattern. And it started to become a bit of an obsession of mine, because I realized that silos is not just a financial system problem. Far from it. If you think about all the scandals, all the disasters that have overwhelmed both public and private sector institutions in recent years, what you see time and time again is something rather similar. If you talk to Mary Barra about why General Motors behaved collectively in such unbelievably dumb ways in relation to the seatbelt story, she's very explicit. It was once again a problem of a big company with tiny silos not talking to each other. If you dig into why the CIA and the other intelligence services failed to see the impending 9/11 problems, again, you see a same pattern. If you look at some of the big fiascos out of the White House in recent years, I mean, a classic is a failure of the Obama mortgage forgiveness campaign. Again, you see this problem. Time and again, it keeps cropping up. And in some ways, it's incredibly ironic, because if you talk to people about this issue of fragmentation and you tell them actually you're worried about it, it's very common for people to say, well, actually, we live in connected ages, don't we? I mean, all of you have got these in your pocket. This is my daughter's rather funky mobile phone case that she gave me. But, you know, we've all got these mobile phones. We've all got the internet connection. Most of us think we live in a world which is actually incredibly connected, hyper-connected, if anything. And yet, in spite of this hyper-connected globe, in spite of the fact that as a system, the ability for shocks to be transmitted around the world very quickly is rising every day, our minds and lives are still surprisingly fragmented. So I set out on a mission in this book really to try and look at two questions. One is, why do we have this problem of fragmentation, and what can we do about it? And on the first question about why we have this problem of fragmentation, why do we have silos? The short and slightly cute answer is, we have silos because we're human. We have silos because we're human. More specifically, if you talk to neurologists or neuroscientists about how the brain works, it's very obvious that we as human beings, as human animals, are surrounded on a day-to-day basis by so much stimuli, so much data, so much stuff, that we need to have systems in our heads and our minds for organizing the world. Otherwise, we just drown in chaos. We all need the equivalent of a mental filing cabinet inside our heads, or if you like, a way to sort out our sock drawer inside our lives to get stuff done. And the more that institutions swell in scale, the more that societies become more complex, the more necessary it is. But it's not just a problem of the advanced industrial Western societies at all. As you just heard, I originally trained as an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, and I would imagine not many of you. Any of you got a background in cultural anthropology? Okay, one, okay? Great. There are two of us in the room then, okay? How many of you are ex-bankers / economists? Okay, we are officially out. Okay, a bit outnumbered. Well, cultural anthropology, for those of you who don't know what it is essentially the study of human beings. But study of human beings looking at the prism of culture. And what marks it out is not so much its subject matter. I mean, people often think anthropologists go and study weird and wacky tribes in the Amazon jungle and then come back with lots of exciting photographs and having had a great holiday, cover it up on their CV. In reality, what anthropology is about a prism for looking at the world. It's a way of trying to study societies. It's not defined by its subject matter, but by its methodology. Because these days, anthropologists actually study the West as much as they do study developing countries. And the hallmark of anthropology is that anthropologists look at the world bottom up. We get our feet dirty by going out and looking at how people really live, rather than sitting in an office and looking top down. And they try and look at the world in a connected way. They try and look at the gap between rhetoric and reality, what people say and what they do. But above all else, they try and use a comparative perspective. Because anthropologists firmly believe that the real value of going to look at another culture, something that's a bit different from you, is not just to understand that other culture, although that's actually very valuable. It's because the best way to make sense of yourself is to step out of yourself for a moment and look at yourself with fresh pairs of eyes to get an insider-outsider perspective. Anthropologists spend a lot of time looking comparatively across societies, not just to try and see how humans vary, but see how they're similar and to put into context how each society operates. And one of the things that anthropologists have realized by looking across different societies is that the process of classification, the process of putting things into boxes, is absolutely endemic. I mean, if you ever do a 101 course in anthropology, or if any of your kids do a 101 course in anthropology, and when I give speeches like this, I'm often collared afterwards by anxious parents saying, my kid wants to study anthropology, will they ever get a job? To which the answer, by the way, is yes. Don't panic. But if you ever do a 101 course in anthropology, you spend a lot of time looking at classification systems, because not only do our brains need mental maps to organize the world, cultures and societies need commonly agreed mental maps too, to organize things just to get stuff done. Otherwise, it's chaos. And it's really out of that silos come, our need to create this classification system, when it becomes very rigid, creates this problem of fragmentation. So you can't deal with silos, the problem of silos, just by saying, oh, let's just abolish silos. I mean, the management consultancy industry periodically says that, but it's ridiculous. You can't. We're hardwired to have silos. And often silos can be very beneficial and very functional. They often make life more efficient. Adam Smith was right. A division of labour is often the most efficient way to get things done. But only if you actually stop and think about it and don't get trapped in stupid, dysfunctional silos that make you essentially do dumb things. So the question then becomes, how do you avoid becoming trapped by silos? And one of the things that's very interesting about anthropology, and this is really sort of, gave me the key idea in this book, is that although anthropologists know that silos are endemic to human society, every society has a classification system, they also know that classification systems aren't identical. They vary quite a lot. We're hardwired to have mental filing cabinets. We don't all have the same mental filing cabinets. We don't have to just organize the world in one way. And out of that very simple idea, I started to look around at companies and institutions which seemed to be not blowing up because of silos. I mean, by 2012, I had a fact file of all these companies which had blown up because of silos. But I began to look around and say, okay, so who hasn't blown up? Who's actually trying to be creative? Who's trying to think about it? And I found a rather long, intriguing list. I won't rehash the book, because hopefully you'll all go out and read it and buy it as Christmas presents for your friends and families, or birthday presents or anything else. However, just give you a few ideas of companies which are doing some very interesting things. One of them is Facebook. Don't know, any of you work for Facebook? I don't think there's a Facebook office around here. I bet probably most of you are on Facebook. Facebook's fascinating because never mind the fact that they've done this incredible computer engineering and they've changed the way that we talk to each other in the wider world. What they've been engaged in recent years is a giant experiment to do social engineering inside their company too. And in particular, they've looked across the tech landscape and they've seen that the tech sector is littered by small dynamic startups that start life as essentially silo-free entities, because if there are 6 kids sitting around in a garage with Chinese takeaway creating a company, they aren't big enough to have silos. And then classically what happens is they start to grow, and then suddenly they turn into bureaucratic behemoths that become very rigid and essentially prone to silos. Microsoft's one example of that. Sony is an example I talk about in the book. If you ever wondered why Sony didn't invent the iPod, it really does come down to silos very much. Silos can make people not just blind to risks, but also to opportunities. And Facebook decided it wanted to be different. It didn't want to be like Xerox or like Sony or like Microsoft. So it decided in about 2008 to take a very specific twin-track approach. It said, we need silos at Facebook in the sense that we need to have dedicated teams, specialist groups, that are able to get stuff done and be focused. We can't have 4,000 engineers all trying to write the same piece of computer code, or it will be chaos. But we need to stop them hardening into little tribes who all go out and compete with each other and all try and kill each other or don't swap information. So it did several practical things. First up, it insisted that everybody who joined Facebook had to go off on what they called a boot camp. Somewhat ironic that all these liberal Silicon Valley hippies insist on using military terminology, but boot camp is essentially where they put all the new recruits, no matter how senior or junior, together for 6 weeks, like a military boot camp. And the excuse is they all have to learn the same computer code. I mean, that's actually rubbish, because that can be taught in half an hour. The reality is what they're trying to do is create a shared common experience that links them as a group. And then when they go and scatter across Facebook into their own little teams and silos, they have social ties that cut across the department boundaries. And Facebook, which is dedicated to social engineering, then does everything it can to keep those ties alive and to keep them constantly meeting and mingling to create, if you like, a second dimension of connectivity and identity in the company. It periodically rotates people around the company. It pulls them together every 6 weeks in all-night hackathons, when basically it locks up, or it doesn't quite lock them up, but it puts all these engineers together in a room and makes them work with somebody they don't know on a common project. I mean, I didn't believe it until I saw it. It's a very, very spooky, weird experience. All these kind of kids sitting around in laptops, and you sit down and say to them, do you know each other's names? They barely know each other's names, and yet they're sitting there and coding. And after they spend a night coding together and eating Chinese takeaway, it just creates another point of connectivity and keeps the boundary walls a bit fluid. They use architecture to keep people moving around. They're constantly encouraging people to bump into each other, to collide with each other. Some of it's gimmicky. They put supermarket doors on their walkways to ensure that these poor Facebook employees don't ever have to stop and open a door when they approach the door. They just keep moving and colliding. They have big open squares where they encourage everyone to get out together and talk to each other, which is obviously a lot easier in the Californian sunshine. But the key point is they're trying to create a company which is both has specialist pools of knowledge, but also isn't hardening into tribes. Very interesting experiments. Another example is Cleveland Clinic. Completely different sector, completely different institution. Any of you doctors here? No, okay. Well, Cleveland Clinic, as many of you know, is one of the biggest hospitals in the world. Interesting little factoid, it's actually the second biggest employer, not just in Cleveland, it's the biggest employer in Cleveland in the entire state of Ohio. Striking sign of industrial change. It's absolutely enormous. And it's a very interesting hospital because it's run by a man called Toby Cosgrove, very strong character, brilliant cardiosurgeon and a cardiothoracic surgeon. And a few years ago, he and a number of other doctors at the hospital noticed that the way that medicine is organized in the Western world is very marked by silos. In some ways, it's almost as strongly marked by silos as economics or any other field. And in particular, when doctors think about medicine, they use a very rigid mental map that divides the world up into people who are paid to cut up other people for a living, and they're called surgeons, people who are not allowed to touch knives, and they're called physicians, and then support staff. And within those three categories, there are many subdivisions. But almost every single hospital you go into is organized roughly along those lines. You have a head of medicine, head of surgery, and then all the rest. And what Toby Cosgrove and the others said is, well, that's a pattern, a structure that suits doctors very well, because that's how they're trained. But it's not actually how patients experience medicine. If you go into a hospital and say something's wrong with you, you don't say, I'd like to see a cardiothoracic surgeon. You say, my heart's hurting, or my head's hurting, or I don't feel well. And partly because of this very rigid segmentation in medicine, and because much of the American medical system is based on not an eat what you kill system, but eat what you treat, i.e. fee for service, you have a very fragmented medical structure where people, for the most part, aren't incentivized to collaborate or to think about medicine in the way that a patient would, as opposed to a doctor. So they said, well, what would happen if we actually turn that mental map of medicine completely upside down and try to organize ourselves based on the mental map that patients use, not doctors? What happens if we took the taxonomy of consumers, or the problem we're trying to solve, rather than based on the taxonomy of the producers? So they did that. Very, very tough, involved enormous amounts of restructuring in the hospital. Very controversial. The rest of the medical establishment hated them, threatened for a period not to give any of their graduating doctors any degrees because they didn't fit into any of the right categories anymore. The insurance companies went nuts because it didn't match their silos for payments anymore. They couldn't make sense of it. So in the end, they had to do a sort of slightly hybrid model. But the interesting thing is that by turning the mental map of medicine upside down and trying to essentially get doctors to reimagine how they produce medicine and how they serve patients, the patient satisfaction levels went through the roof, shot up. Cleveland Clinic went from being at the bottom of the list to being near the top of the list in America. I mean, I tell the story in my book as well. And it's got a lot of implications for a lot of other industries and sectors. I mean, if you're working in a company, if you stop and say to yourself, how would I organize my company or my organization if I was trying to base it around the end problem we're trying to solve and work backwards rather than just go forwards? Because what so often happens in companies is that you get trapped into, or any organization, you get trapped into the silos that suited the world 20 years ago, but just doesn't move on. And people get incentivized to defend the past systems. They can't see how the world's changing. One last quick example, and then I'll stop, which is technology. Technology is a bit of a double-edged sword because in some ways it can actually make silos much, much worse. Far too often people essentially go onto the internet, go into cyberspace, use technology to communicate, thinking they're becoming more connected, and don't actually notice that technology often sucks us into deeper silos than ever before because we don't even notice what it's doing to us. But sometimes, if you use technology cleverly, if you use technology and your brain, you can actually use it to break down silos in some very exciting, creative ways. Because the great thing about data and computing and technology is that it doesn't have preset channels to organize itself in unless we give them that channels. Essentially, data can be mixed and matched in very creative ways that can help you sometimes to see the world entirely differently. And the example that really showed me that was the example of Bloomberg's New York City Hall. Pretty close to home. New York City Hall, as probably most of you know, like most government institutions, is one gigantic, nightmarish bureaucracy, entirely Kafkaesque, absolutely enormous. Very rigid silos, both the formal organizational silos, but also the informal, rigid mental map that everyone uses to divide up the different workers. There are apparently 250 different job descriptions inside New York City Hall, and woe behind anyone who tries to break them down. The unions won't have it. And when Mayor Bloomberg came in about a decade ago, he tried initially to break down the silos by playing around with architecture, appealing to everyone to communicate and try and coordinate. And he didn't really have a lot of impact, to be honest, apart from amongst the top senior officials. He did manage to get them out of their little cubby holes where they were working, their sort of marble rabbit hutches, as he called them, and got them to sit together and talk to each other. But for the most part, most of the silos inside New York City government stayed very rigid. But one area where he did manage to get a bit of change was in the question of data management. In 2010, he brought in a very innovative, freewheeling lawyer who was originally charged with trying to look at financial fraud, and then became very interested in the question of whether you could use data to break down some of the silos. The first example he did was in relation to New York City fires. There's a huge number of house fires each year in New York City, and traditionally the fire department inspectors, have been absolutely useless at predicting which buildings are going to go up in flames. And the reason is that the data that the fire department collects on fires, and 311 calls in particular, is no good at all in terms of predicting where the fires are going to be, because most 311 calls come from Manhattan, and most house fires happen out in the outer boroughs. And for the most part, the people who are living in unsafe accommodation don't want to call into 311 and report it. So what they did was say, okay, here we have a classic problem of a silo. The fire department wants to use its fire department data. Everyone assumes that that's the obvious place to look for dealing with house fires, but maybe there's another way. So they said, what happens if we look across the rest of New York City Hall and take in pools of data from other departments and put it together? Incredibly obvious step, but nobody had ever thought of doing that before because of these mental tunnels. Fire department data is what you look at for fires. So they did that. They pulled together data from all over New York City Hall. They looked at things like mortgage defaults, vermin infestation. They looked at childhood poverty indicators. They put it all together on a single map and then handed that to the fire department inspectors. And at a stroke, without doing anything else, the fire department inspection suddenly became 5 times more effective in terms of spotting which buildings were fire traps. Simply putting the data together had an incredible difference. So then they said, well, let's take this further. And they looked at other areas of government. My favourite is the problem of yellow grease. Do any of you know what yellow grease is? It's a big, big issue if any of you ever lived in Manhattan. Yellow grease is basically what you get in kitchens in restaurants in New York after you've fried your spring rolls, French fries, chop suey, whatever else. And there's a huge amount of it in New York City because guess what? There's a lot of fried food. And in theory, you're supposed to pay somebody to take that yellow grease away. In practice, most restaurants don't because they know what to pay money and they've all watched The Sopranos and they know what waste disposal companies do. So it's a true story. A lot of restaurants have actually been dealing with it by tipping it down the nearest manhole cover. And if you go into the New York sewage system, there are big, fat, big deposits of yellow grease. Or there were. Because until recently, it was impossible for anyone in City Hall to stop the yellow grease dumps because there were too many restaurants and too few inspectors, and they dumped yellow grease at 3 o'clock in the morning. And of course, until recently, they hadn't really had data on yellow grease dumps except from the environmental department. But once again, what they did was they took data pools from different parts of the New York City Hall. Again, very obvious, no one had done it. Put it together, tried to reimagine the problem and think outside the box. And once again, they started to crack down, identify which restaurants were dumping yellow grease. And then they did something else. They suddenly said, well, hang on a sec. Some of this yellow grease might actually be useful. In a separate corner of the gigantic bureaucracy, we have a department called the Biodiesel Recycling Department. How about we take those people and put them into the restaurants that are dumping yellow grease and tell them to buy the yellow grease? We could recycle it. Didn't change the world. It'd be nice to say that there is no more yellow grease in the New York sewage system. Not quite the case. But these days, there are a chunk of restaurants who are selling their yellow grease to the biodiesel industry as a result. And in some ways, that's one of the most cheering messages of all, I think, because it doesn't take a miracle. It doesn't take a revolution to start breaking down silos. There are things that we can all do if we're willing to just think a bit outside the box, or rather try and shuffle the boxes around. But the first step we all have to take is recognize that there are boxes in our lives. Recognize that we all inherit a cultural map, a classification system that most of us never think about, that we will become prisoners to if we don't think about. And yet, if we are willing to think about it and challenge it a bit, we don't just not blow up. We don't just not behave in dumb ways. Sometimes we can actually be very, very smart too and innovative. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I've spoken a bit longer than I should have done, but very happy to take questions on that or anything else, or the FT, or Donald Trump. So, thank you. I think there's a question over there, and then there's 2 or 3 over there.
I noticed in your Facebook example they use socializing, kind of a human proclivity, but Cleveland Clinic and the other examples were purely systematic, either reward or just some sort of force. Do you feel that having a human motivation is recommended as well as a systemic modification?
Yeah, totally. I was summarizing considerably. I mean, in the Facebook example, in a sense, what makes Facebook different from a bank is you're not incentivized financially to just hug your little brilliant idea or your trade to yourself, because they don't reward employees just on the basis of however brilliant your personal computer code was. That's very important. One of the biggest problems with finance, and frankly with Western medicine in many cases, is that you are given either an eat what you kill system in finance or an eat what you treat system in medicine. So actually Facebook, incentives matter too. Or, in the case of Cleveland Clinic, I mean, yes, it wasn't just a question of organizational restructuring. They worked extremely hard to try and get people to buy into it and to change their own mental map. And they weren't just breaking down the silos between surgery, medicine, and support. They were also trying to get doctors to rethink perhaps the most fundamental silo, which is this idea that medicine is a technical thing, and then you have this thing called emotions and spirit. They were trying to combine body and soul in a way that, traditional medicine would consider to be quite touchy-feely. I mean, Toby Cosgrove did things like send the surgeons off to Disneyland for courses on customer care, which was quite a shock. If any of you dealt with surgeons, you'll know that. He tried to change the status system around, because traditionally surgeons are the Brahmins of the medical world. And he put, a radiologist in charge of a neurosurgeon, which was quite a shock. So he was trying to play around with mental maps as well, or, the way that people incentivize people to cooperate more. It's tough, I mean, the Cleveland Clinic experiment is controversial, but if nothing else, it's thought-provoking. Right.
I'm a retired teacher, and when you were talking about the silo effect in the schools, I always found it very frustrating that no teachers get together and talk with each other. No separate grades, like all the 5th graders or all the 8th grade teachers, ever think about getting together and finding out what works with what students. It's all so very silo structured.
Yeah.
I thought about that when you were, and unless the principal, it seems to me, makes a insistence that all the particular teachers that teach a certain subject get together, it's just always very compartmentalized.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. I mean, one of the curses of the modern age is that we're also darn busy. We don't have space or time to roam or to take time to talk to each other. And whenever you get organizations which are under pressure to be efficient, which is most public companies these days, it becomes very hard to defend the kind of slack you need in the system to try and break down silos a bit. And that applies to the academic world. And I'm very worried by the degree to which kids these days are encouraged in both their academic life and in their hobbies to become very specialized very early. I was chatting to people earlier about in relation to the Girl Scouts. I mean, one of the great things about the Girl Scouts when I was a kid was you kind of had to go at everything. Today, most kids are put into specialized clubs, and they don't all interact. If you're a ballet dancer, you don't go and talk to, the soccer players or whatever. And the other thing that deeply worries me, actually, almost as much as the educational system, is this issue of social media and the fact that these constantly suck kids into silos and into tribal behavior online in ways they aren't even aware of. How many of you here are on Twitter for the wrong age group? Okay, some of you. Okay, right. Well, those of you who are on Twitter, I would leave you with a thought, which is to challenge you that when you go home tonight, look at who you've chosen to follow on Twitter. Because most of you use Twitter because you think it connects you to the world. And I would bet you that 99% of the people who you're following on Twitter are people who are basically a bit like you, kind of part of your tribe. Maybe 70% if you're broad-minded. And it's worth trying from time to time, a sort of experiment, and I've done this with my own kids, and say, listen, what would happen if you were to knock out, say, half the people you follow on Twitter and put in a completely different set of people from different worlds just for a week, and see how the world looks through their eyes. Basic principle of anthropology. Try put in, I don't know, Chinese activist, a Brazilian union worker, a supporter of Donald Trump and a supporter of Elizabeth Warren, okay? Just try and put in a whole range of different people into your Twitter feed, and then you'll see just how subtly the temptation can be online to get into silos that we're not even aware of. And that applies to kids too. Lots of...
Oh, I too am a retired teacher, and I thought of the education system as you were speaking, but it's very difficult when I was teaching to get the teachers to want to change their ways, and it must be very difficult in other industries to get people to buy into this. I would think the first problem is getting people to buy into thinking, for want of a better word, globally, rather than just for themselves.
Yeah, it's extremely hard. I'm not minimizing the problems. But hey, overcoming human anger is hard. Our tendency to fragmentation is part of our human nature. But it doesn't mean that we have to roll over and say, okay, we're going to, basically give up. And the flip side, I will say, is that if you can silo bust in a world where most other people are marred by silos, you get a wonderful competitive edge. Most innovation, most creativity is actually because people have thought outside the boxes, or tried to mix up the boxes, or tried to think differently in some way. So, if nothing else, that should try and be an incentive to at least create a tiny space in all of our lives, just to try and imagine what would happen if we were to break down some of these categories and boundaries. But it's not easy, I agree. I say that as a journalist. We as journalists, we tend to get trapped into silos too. I mentioned earlier about the FT and how we had the economists on the second floor and the markets team in the basement. The great news is that, from about 2006, I became kind of obsessed about this. And I spent a lot of time trotting up and down between the two because I happened by chance to be one of the few people who'd worked in both departments. And we actually began to really work pretty closely, partly because of the financial crisis. These days, the financial team is sitting bang in the center of the newsroom. We've been promoted from the garbage cans into the center of the newsroom. And there actually is a sense of integration. Doesn't mean we won't have another set of silos, cropping up in another part of the organization. But, if you think about it actively, you can try to, remake the world.
Thank you. Many times, trying to bust silos, the people in charge of the silos sometimes have a situation where they're afraid of losing their power,
Absolutely.
their prestige. Maybe they're not as bright as they think they were if they were busting silos and then all of a sudden the emperor has no clothes. So how would you handle a situation where a certain number of people in the silos would like to change, but yet have to confront?
Well, the reality is what happens these days is the market handles it for you via disruption. And I tell the story of Sony in my book. Sony's fascinating. How many of you had a Sony Walkman growing up? Okay, more than are now on Twitter anyway. I had one. I bet most of you have never thought about why it is that you don't have a Sony Walkman today. I mean, if I asked you, you'd probably say, oh, it's because nobody wants those wretched, cassette tapes anymore. None of us want to have boring, old-fashioned analog products. But if you stop and think about it, there's no reason why Sony couldn't have actually created the iPod. And in fact, in 1999, the assumption across the industry was that Sony was going to create the digital version of the Walkman, because it was the only company on the planet then which had everything you needed to do that. Sitting inside Sony in 1999, you had brilliant and consumer electronic skills, amazing hardware. You had brilliant software computing skills, VIO. You had an incredibly powerful brand name that consumers adored. And you had content. You had, essentially music, all inside Sony. So if anybody was going to create, the digital Walkman, it should have been Sony. And what happened was that it tried. In fact, at the end of 1999, it put out a digital Walkman. But the problem was, it didn't just put out one digital Walkman, It put out 2 digital Walkmans and then a third. Because, classic example, what you're talking about, each department was essentially run by people who were incentivized to defend their department at all costs and didn't want to collaborate with other people. And so each department, you had 3 different departments putting out competing products who wouldn't actually collaborate and work together. I mean, at the time, people took it for granted. It's like, okay, that's another example of just how brilliant Sony is. In retrospect, it was completely nuts. And what happened was basically they put out these 2 and then 3 digital Walkmans. They all competed with each other. They were all pretty hopeless, and they didn't work. And so in came Apple, disruptor. And Apple was run by a man, Steve Jobs, who was absolutely religious about silo busting. He actually had silo busted in his own life. He credited the fact that he dreamt up those beautiful Macs and all those cursive scripts because in his youth he dropped out of college and by accident ended up in a Japanese calligraphy course and didn't use it for years and years and years. But years later, when he was in IT, he then pulled together computing skills and Japanese calligraphy and silo busted. That's what I mean by being creative and innovative. But Steve Jobs basically wouldn't tolerate silos. And I mean, I won't go into the details, but, he basically said, we're only going to do a few products and smash everything together. So inside Apple, he managed to smash together software, hardware, and content in an incredibly innovative way. If you think about what's involved in dreaming up the iTunes store and dreaming up the iPod and that 2-stage downloading process, it requires incredible silo busting. So that's why we have iPods today. Sony was unable to break it down. It got disrupted. I personally think something very similar is going to happen to the car industry. Because I don't think the auto industry yet understands the need to get the metal bashers in the same department as the IT department and software department. And that will be Silicon Valley's great advantage, is that they can actually bash that down together and then come in. Anyway.
The current controversy on whether England, the UK stays in the common market, joins the common market, or stays independent. It seems to me they have the best of both worlds, non-EU regulation and good trade balances. Is it primarily a political decision?
Yeah, primarily politics, because nobody understands the economics apart from about 5 people. Most of them work with the FT, I think. I'm joking. It's politics. And these days, as we know in the Western world, politics is very unpredictable because there's a very populist mood. So my best guess right now is that it's actually 50-50 what happens next. I think it would be moderately crazy for the UK to leave. I think most Americans, looking at the issue from this side of the Atlantic, think it would be completely nuts. They don't understand the issue at all, partly because they live in a federal structure. But political feelings in the UK are running high right now. 50-50 Brexit, yes. And if we do have Brexit, then there's a good chance that Scotland leaves. So there's a good, there is a non-negligible, actually no, I think it's 55%, probably 55% that the UK stays. I still think it's narrowly in favour of staying within the European Union. But geopolitical maps are being redrawn right now at a stunning speed, in many ways, and political maps too. The Europeans are very worried about Trump. The rest of the world is absolutely stunned, dazzled, and shocked by Trump. Can I quickly ask, for my own curiosity, how many of you in the room would vote for Trump at the moment? Okay, 1, okay. No, I'm actually genuinely curious, okay? 2, okay? Yeah, I'm not, And how many of you, I mean, you don't have to say this, but how many of you, if you'd like to, say, would consider yourselves to be Republican? Okay, all right. Interesting. I actually asked this question in Philadelphia last week, and I'd say probably about a third of the room were Trump supporters. So I'm constantly very curious about, how that's developing right now. But
good evening. You spoke about the banks, in hindsight, missing the mortgage-backed security and the traders there. Sitting where you are now, do you think the banks are better run, they are less siloed? And if you were to look at your crystal ball, which area do you think would be the mortgage-backed securities of 2018 or 2020?
Okay, well, good news is that every single person in a senior bank management room has discovered the joys of holistic risk management. They are all obsessed with holistic risk management and joining up the dots. One of the things I didn't mention about UBS is UBS, bless it, had 3,000 risk managers in 2007 who were supposed to look at the problems inside UBS. And one of the reasons why they failed to spot them was because, guess what? Those 3,000 risk managers were subdivided into 3 different silos that didn't talk to each other either. You had, market risk, operational risk, and credit risk. These days, UBS is typical. It's smashed those silos together. It has a lot of holistic risk management. It's done a lot of really good things to try and break down the silos. Problems, though, is one, regulators have ironically been reimposing silos in terms of how they regulate the banks, which is one of the completely nutty things about what's happened post-2008. That's a big issue. And 2, I firmly believe for what it's worth that actually the banks themselves are fast on their way to becoming stunningly boring utilities, very similar to what happened in the 1950s. They just ain't, it's virtually impossible to make money, cover your cost of capital in investment banking these days. It ain't going to change anytime soon. And that's concealed by the fact you have all these consumer finance operations or consumer banking, happening. But, investment banking is, I don't think that's where the risk is. The risk in spades is in the rest of the system right now. And regulators have pushed that out into what's called, broadly speaking, the shadow banking world. And I think the fact you've got so much credit creation happening out of institutions that are often thinly capitalized, often, incredibly opaque, so many investors, holding securities they don't understand, so much of the market dominated by computer trading systems that nobody understands, is at best, somewhat alarming. There's a reason why many of the really smart money managers I speak to these days are putting more and more of their assets into cash to batten down the hatches.
That feeds into my question, actually. The 2 areas right now that cause the most fear for us in finance, I think, are cybersecurity and market structure, specifically derivatives.
Yeah.
Because of the inherent challenges with sharing of information, and in the case of derivatives, it took really a complete lack of one oversight. One regulatory body overseeing these things which trade, and it's 10 to 50 times the notional value of everything else.
Yeah.
Your opinion on derivatives and cybersecurity?
Well, my main opinion is I don't fully understand what's going on there. But there is a pattern here, which is that, another way of looking at the silo problem is to say that, we live in a world which is hyper-connected, where shocks move across the globe at stunning speed, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a market shock, whether it's an economic shock, etc., etc. And yet, we also have a system where we have these little geeks in silos scurrying around doing stuff that have the potential to impact us all, but nobody else understands what the heck they're doing inside their little silo. The asymmetries of knowledge and the asymmetries of dependence are incredibly high. The BIS often draws the Bank for International Settlements between the financial system and the medical world, where essentially you have people creating products or doing things that can affect everybody, which have a wider public impact, and yet often you have privatized information and very little oversight. And it comes back to anthropology. The reason why people weren't looking at mortgage-backed securities before 2007 wasn't so much because bankers were necessarily hiding it through some gigantic James Bond plot. Yes, there were some traders who were trying to keep stuff under the desk, but for the most part, it was hidden in plain sight. And it was not being looked at just because of the mental maps inside our brains and the fact that people define this stuff as kind of geeky and boring and dull. Similar problems today in many other parts of the derivatives world, in shadow banking and in cybersecurity. Is sort of looking into all these details of how, internet works. It's often seen as being geeky and dull, and so people kind of ignore it, which of course gives people a lot of power inside those silos, but that's part of the problem.
I'm curious if you've seen the movie The Big Short. It's
I have,
related.
yes, yeah.
I'd like to know your opinion on the movie.
Well, like any movie, it has failings and flaws, and a bit like my book, my stories I tell in my book, or my last book, you can sit there and say, oh, you've only got 60% of the truth, you've streamlined the narrative to try and communicate these complicated stories and stuff. So yes, it's stereotypical in places, yes, it is a bit of a caricature, but actually, to my mind, the underlying principle is very valid. And to go back to your question, I am passionately supportive of anything which helps to communicate complex, geeky topics to a wider public. We need more of that stuff. The pity is it takes a crisis before anyone does that. But, I would love to see a movie like The Big Short being made about cyber finance or cyber risks today to try and get people to understand what's going on inside this whole world of cyber hacking. I'd love to see that on things like, one of my great, pet passions is antibiotic resistance, which again is an issue which almost nobody understands, but is incredibly important for all of us. So for that reason alone, I think everybody should go and see The Big Short. Right.
Thank you, Gillian. We hope to see you in April with humorous Jerry Zezima will be here. Thank you very much for coming. That was terrific. Thank you.